Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest in this series of podcasts. I'm John Peelan, Director of the Scottish Council on Archives. The theme of this series has been objectivity and neutrality in the archives, and today I'm delighted to welcome Arike Oke, who's the Managing Director for Black Cultural Archives, the home of Black British history. Erica has worked in heritage for over 15 years, from the seminal Connecting History project in Birmingham to building Wellcome Collections Archive and co-convening Hull's first Black History Month. So welcome, Erica.
It's really, really good to be invited to chat to you, John.
So tell me a little bit about your background and your journey to your current position as Director of Black Cultural Archives.
Sure. So my first degree was in history at the University of Birmingham, and I think that was probably the first time that I came across archives. I remember I don't know if anyone listening to this will remember the old library in Birmingham, the one that was knocked down for the amazing new building there. But the old library in Birmingham had a local history library, and then at the back of the local history library was this white wrought iron spiral staircase that led up to this mysterious upper level, which was the archive. And I think in my undergraduate degree, I probably only used the local history library and was just too frightened to try and go up those tiny white steps into the archive proper. But that was certainly the first time that I heard of archives. After university, had all sorts of jobs, from working in care homes, day centres and call centres, but then became a registrar of births, deaths and marriages, and that was the second time that I came across archives. So very much the historical records that probate researchers were using, that family historians were using, the registration records that go back to Victorian times of births, deaths and marriages. And that was a really amazing job that I did for a few years, and amazing because you get to meet pretty much everybody. That was when I lived in Leeds. So from people who were travellers, and people with poor literacy levels, or who didn't have English as a first language, and so, registering a birth or a death had a certain kind of difficulty to it. To people, who were getting married because one of them were, in hospital of a serious illness, right? So you meet all sorts of people alongside the sort of more day-to-day births, deaths and marriages. But I really missed the historical side of things when I was doing that job. And at that time, my mum was working at the University of Royal Holloway, and I was talking to her about, okay, well, what could I do next? Because I really like people's stories. I really love to interact with human beings and hear about their stories and their lives and how they've got to where they've got to, which is the same reason that I liked doing a history degree. But I also still didn't want to kind of move away too far from the historical documents. I really, very much love that hands-on that you can have as an archivist with the documentary heritage. And my mum at that time, she was friends with the archivist at Royal Holloway, Nikki Sugar. I think Nikki works in Bristol somewhere now. And it was Nikki who suggested, well, has she ever thought about working in archives? And so that was how I ended up applying to be a trainee archivist in the Connecting Histories project back in Birmingham. So finally made it up those wrought iron stairs into the archives, into Birmingham City Archives. And that project was all about representing and reframing and resharing the histories of the communities of Birmingham, on the basis that the archives reflected them and were from them, but were not necessarily used by them. And so that was, a very formational experience for me in terms of my archives practice. So that was the first time, that I'd had a full-on archives job, whenever that was, probably about 15 years ago now. And that was also the first time that I'd heard of Black Cultural Archives. And at that point, BCA, Black Cultural Archives, was fundraising for its building. It didn't have a permanent home at that point. And so I find it, really kind of beautiful for my personal career journey that I've closed that circle of starting out as a trainee archivist, hearing about Black Cultural Archives, supporting their capital project, to now being managing director of Black Cultural Archives and working and operating and protecting the building, One Windrush Square, that BCA operates out of now, which was the result of that capital project.
Well, it's a really interesting story, and I'm intrigued by what you said about your, as you described, a formational experience in Birmingham. Before that, though, you had an interest in history, and you were, archives was something that was a draw to you. What do you think your experience of archives would have been like if you hadn't had that pretty early on in your career formational experience in Birmingham?
I really don't know. So I think when I was working on Connecting Histories, it was such a values-led project, such a mission-led project. The community, whatever community it was at that particular moment, we were dealing with Irish histories, Jewish histories, African Caribbean histories, Asian descent histories in Birmingham. But whoever's the community was for each collection, it was completely at the heart and the full motivation of what we were doing. And so when I moved on to other archive jobs after Connecting Histories, I just wasn't sure whether I wanted to be an archivist, because actually what I wanted to do was work with archives and communities and humans, and and really I just wasn't sure, is there a role for me in the traditional archives world as it was at the time that I left Connecting Histories. And so after Connecting Histories, I moved to Hull History Centre as the audience development officer for the History Centre, which was essentially setting up its entire audience development programme for the whole city of Hull, because Hull History Centre was really new. It was a collaboration between the University of Hull and Hull City Council. It didn't exist prior to the project that set it up, which was the project that I was working on. And I did my archives qualification distance learning with Aberystwyth, which I had started as a trainee at Connecting Histories. But for a while when I worked in Hull, I didn't know whether I'd bother finishing it, really, because I really kind of struggled with the idea of what a traditional archivist might be, and whether it was a sector or a profession that would be in any way welcoming to someone like me. And certainly, after I left Hull and I was looking for other archives work, I do think there was a sort of element of the archives world itself going I'm not sure that we do want someone like you. Perhaps we could have someone more fresh-faced from Oxbridge. Although, actually in between Connecting Histories and Hull, I actually worked as the archivist at Toynbee Hall, which is a social justice charity in East London. And so that, it's these kind of doing something mission-based was really at the heart. And I just wasn't super keen on, I guess, what we might talk about later, about this kind of idea of the sort of archivists that people might have in their heads, which is a phenomenologically neutral person who is kind of filleting information and representing it for family historians and local historians, but without a kind of dialogue or engagement with those people or the communities, the source communities for the collections.
So in Birmingham, before the Connecting History projects, obviously Birmingham, like any large city, is a metropolis with many different cultures and people from lots of different backgrounds. But would you say that, before that project, that their stories were not being adequately represented within the record of the city, or are being misrepresented even.
I think their stories are being collected, but whether that meant that they had any sense of ownership of the stories and the histories and how the histories were told and how the histories were catalogued or described or represented is another matter. I think Birmingham, being an incredibly diverse city, has probably been thinking about these issues longer than other cities which have a less diverse ethnic makeup or ethnic population. But in terms of like interactions between the archive collection and the archive service and the archive staff and the communities that they serve and essentially kind of extract material from, that's, it's a different matter.
So you touched on neutrality there, and obviously that's a key subject that we've been discussing in this series. And I wonder what's your feeling, having worked in the sector for over 15 years now, what's your feeling about the idea that the archivist is a neutral agent, or perhaps shouldn't be a neutral agent in terms of managing and processing archival material?
So on my training to be an archivist, the Aberystwyth course, I feel like the training that I had was super traditional, and I don't think it's really what is on any of the archive courses, particularly now. But that was part of the training, the expectation of impartiality, the expectation that you would minus yourself and minus your opinion or your personality or your background, your upbringing, your kind of worldview from your work, which kind of you can kind of see how that's arrived at as a philosophy for archival education and archival practice, but it's not something that I think any archivist, no matter how much they want to embrace that concept and continue to teach it, I don't think it's a concept that is really practical. And in your day-to-day practice, it's impossible to completely divorce everything that you think and know and feel about the world from the work that you're doing, especially when the pillars of archival practice are things like appraisal and description and acquisitions, collections development, and all of those things are decision-based activities. Cataloguing, you could make a decision on this is a collection that people want to use a lot, and so we'll prioritize it for cataloguing, or it's a collection that would be easy to catalogue, so we'll prioritize it for cataloguing. But those aren't impartial decisions, and if people are requesting a collection that's uncatalogued, that is something to do with the amount of visibility that the archivist has chosen to give that collection, or to do with the people who feel welcomed and confident enough to request collections. So there's always always some level of curation, no matter what there is, but especially in the role of appraisal and collections development. And you can have a collections policy that is very blank and says, we are the local authority for this particular area, so we will only collect businesses from this area and personal papers from this area. But then does that then mean that you're just passively receiving what's offered to you? Does it mean that you try and engage in what the local area is and what the spirit of the time is, or what the contemporaneous society in the local area, or what the hopes and dreams of the council might even be for the area? And do you try and collect around those things? It's not possible to be responsive as an archivist when you're impartial or neutral. And if it's not possible to be responsive, then I would argue it's probably not possible to do your job.
Well, that's really interesting. And this idea of archivists being trained to, as you described, minus themselves and be impartial. Would you say that it's impartiality that as you've described it, might be part of the problem. But is it impartiality that pervades archival processes, or is it actually something else that because archives tend to represent the mainstream, because the mainstream tends to exclude perhaps underrepresented or marginalized communities, that maybe it's not impartiality at all. It's actually something quite subjective in terms of decisions that are being made.
I don't know why archives should only reflect the mainstream. I think that would be something to challenge if that's the feeling that an archivist has about their practice, that they must reflect the mainstream. I think that in itself is already starting to disrupt and distort what the historical record is. If it's only going to be the mainstream, that's a really super subjective position to take already. I think something that we can look at as a way to kind of think about this question is this idea that's starting to spring up a lot in museums, especially in the discourse around museums, around contested heritage. So we've moved away from starting to talk about language of decolonizing. We've started to move away from language around repatriation of collections, and we've started to talk more like this phrase contested histories has started, or contested heritage has started to come in more and more as an attempt to kind of try and make a kind of neutral sounding language around a particular piece of curatorial practice. But I would say that that's probably a misdirect in and of itself, because if professional standards are adhered to, then it's not really contested, right? Like if you're researching something, it's not a contested history. If you're researching it to a certain professional and academic standard, you're not contesting that it's historical. But if the idea is that anything that's not part of the mainstream is not part of history, and it's just like a nice to have or an add-on, I would say that's like a very sort of problematic and subjective viewpoint to our position to take.
That word contested is quite interesting. And in previous podcasts in this series, we've talked about the idea of the record being something that, in spite of perhaps earlier definitions, is not static in space and time, but is actually open to different interpretations according to different cultures and the interpretation of the user. Would you agree with that histories as they are apparent in the archive are open for interpretation and reinterpretation?
Absolutely. I mean, any statement anyway is open for interpretation and reinterpretation. And so a document sitting within a collection will in and of itself not be able to resist interpretation and reinterpretation. I suppose one of the in this kind of wider sort of discussion of semantics around impartiality and what's contested, I think the central reason of why we talk about impartiality is to permit interpretation. So, the archivist is not supposed to try and influence the researchers or future researchers or theoretical researchers' interpretation that they bring and project onto the archive. And that's, a really useful reason for attempting impartiality and description, so that you can create this blank canvas upon which the researcher or the historian or the artist or family historian, whoever's using the collection, can then project what they want to on it. So records in and of themselves aren't impartial, but the presentation of the record should attempt, in terms of archival theory, to permit interpretation to happen. And I guess that's one of the reasons why archivists more and more fight against the idea that they themselves, as the practitioner, have to be an impartial person, because they understand that impartiality can't exist, and so it actually can not in even AI, artificial intelligence programs, are not able to be impartial because they start to take on the bias of their programmers, or they start to take on the bias of whatever they're trained to learn from. So if a computer program can't be impartial, and a living human being that's interacting and part of society can't be impartial, but I think that the intention to try and present records, archives, collections in a way that doesn't impede other people's interpretations is probably what we're actually trying to talk about when we talk about impartiality.
In an earlier talk, Arike, I heard you describe archives as the soul of the past. That's a phrase I really like, and I wondered, what do you mean by that?
I have no recollection of saying that, but probably what I was thinking about when I said that was really about the idea of the zeitgeist and the spirit of the time, or the spirit of the age, and how there's something about when you're looking at what survives from the past, from the ruins of the past, are what survive as archives. When you're looking at that, perhaps there's something that can be captured about that spirit of the time. And as archivists who are collecting archivists, doing acquisitions and collections development, perhaps we should be taught and trained and challenge ourselves to be attuned to what is the underlying spirit of the time, and how can we try and capture it so that it can be represented or re-represented to the next generations that are to come. That might be what I meant. I don't remember saying it. So I might have meant something else.
No, well, it's a lovely phrase, and you described it very well. You mentioned earlier, you referenced this. I think you referenced this oft-used phrase about decolonizing the archive. And in an earlier podcast from this series, Professor Michelle Caswell from the University of California, she spoke about the influence of, as it's described, white, ethnically European, bourgeois, Christian, heterosexual, able-bodied, male presence, mainstream world outlook on archives in terms of what's kept and what's dismissed. And I wondered what you felt about that as somebody who's worked in the sector, and particularly in your role as director of Black Cultural Archives. Do you think that that influence is still there? Is it there in the soul of the archive, and is it something that's gradually being eroded?
So I curated with the Kew Gardens Archives a panel session recently on the topic of decolonising archives. And so we had speakers like James Lowry, who's an academic, Mel Grant from Wellcome Collection, Rebecca Adams from London Metropolitan Archives, all trying to talk about that idea of decolonising archives from different perspectives. And a perspective that I thought was really interesting that I hadn't really engaged with before was Dr. Lowry's perspective around how archival education really influences that question, that idea that you're talking about. So many archivists around the world, and pretty much within the British Commonwealth, receive their archival education in Britain or America, and so that Western archival education is almost having its own colonial present in predominating the practice globally, right? So, and I thought that's so interesting to kind of think about how how Western archival education is actually the kind of predominant archival education, and also about, he talked a lot about displaced archives, so archives that are taken from their places of origin, possibly because of war, possibly because of, a colonial power, or a country kind of gaining independence from a colonial power. And so archives become displaced from their places of origin. And then so there's these kind of two things happening at once. There's displaced archives, and then there's also archivists whose education is a Western education, which might not understand, well, probably doesn't understand or speak to the cultural norms and the cultural practice, or have the cultural understanding of the country that those archivists then go back to practice in, and how that kind of there could be kind of flexing of practice in those cases, but also that I think there's kind of a lot of work we need to do as a kind of international archives community to try and think of types of archival practice that genuinely are international and not only kind of dictated by Western practice. So I don't think that's really what you were asking, but it kind of occurred to me as you were asking the question. The dominance of heterosexual white male perspectives. Obviously, white men have a diversity of perspectives themselves, but we do, there is a certain kind of type of heterosexual white male perspective that is probably still at the leadership level in the UK archive sector. And while we do have a lot of women or people who identify as women in the UK archival sector, we do not have actually statistically that many of those women in leadership positions, and there's still it's a still very ethnically white profession. I think the last time the questionnaire was sent out by ARA, I think it was something like 97%. I probably got that number wrong, but it was something like 97% ethnically white profession. And there are definitely things that are being looked at around that. So I also sit on the Unlocking Archives group, the strategic board for the National Archives, and things that the National Archives are looking at in their sectoral lead role, making sure that there are different routes into the profession, like apprenticeships. But there's also a kind of there's a sort of assumption there that that's because people of ethnic minorities would not be able to take the university route, which is strange. And actually, it's probably more that the profession does not feel like somewhere that someone who's not white or Oxbridge or able to afford to volunteer to get the experience to do a standard university course in archives, it doesn't feel like the sort of profession where you're going to be welcomed. And that's certainly something that was on my mind when I was not sure whether I wanted to be an archivist. It was like, do I do this? Am I up for the kind of emotional and psychological burden of constantly having to deal with I didn't have this word in my vocabulary then, but the microaggressions we say now that you always have to deal with as a minority person of colour in a job role. And in archives, you're not only the minority person of colour in the staff team, but you're probably the minority in the people who come in for research. And it is really difficult. It is a really big emotional weight. My experience at Black Cultural Archives is completely different. It's the first place that I've worked where it's majority people of African and of African Caribbean descent, and I almost didn't realise how much of a kind of constant mental burden it is to be a minority person of colour in a workplace until I started working at BCA and just felt like that burden lift. And I've got a new team member with us, relatively new. She started in autumn, and having chats with her, it's kind of interesting because she's still she still sort of says things like, "Oh, I don't know if anyone's interested in what I've got to say in staff meetings," and then she kind of confided in me later that was because in all of her other jobs she's been squashed down, and when she tries to say something, no one is interested in listening. And she said she's only just starting to realise, how what sort of toxicity there were in other workplaces as a woman of colour. Her voice wasn't listened to or wasn't heard.
No, that's a really interesting story that you've told, and I wondered, could we maybe extend that to how the Black community in the UK would have felt before Black Cultural Archives in terms of the representation of their stories? I suppose what I'm asking is, what impact on the lives of the Black community does this feeling of having stories either repressed or distorted have? And if that is the case, perhaps you could speak a little bit about why Black Cultural Archives was created and what was the need behind it.
Right. So Black Cultural Archives, its legal name is African People's Historical Monument Foundation, in brackets Black Cultural Archives, which is a really, really long name. So we just call ourselves Black Cultural Archives, or BCA. But you can tell from that name that it was 100% born from that desire to have some place where Black stories would be recorded and kept and documented and told and celebrated and given a platform. It was born from an absolute hunger within Black communities to have that kind of space. It grew out of the continuing, actually, supplementary and Saturday school movement, in which Black parents, finding that their children were at an educational disadvantage because of institutional racism in the education system. So Black parents would come together and make things called supplementary schools or Saturday schools, and they would teach kids a bit more about Black history, as well as other topics. So it was like a catch-up thing, as well as it being a space where parents could be sure that their children were not being given like a negative view of their own ethnicity. So Black Cultural Archives was a successor and a complement to the supplementary school movement. Black Cultural Archives also came out of the civil unrest in the 1980s, so the 1981 Brixton uprisings, which is sometimes characterised as the Brixton riots, which was again to do with the institutional racism in the way that policing of communities was carried out in the 1980s. That's not a controversial thing to say. That is the police service also acknowledged that as being the fact for that time period. And BCA really just the idea from the collective of parents, artists, activists, educators that banded together to make BCA were specifically doing it in order to create a Black-led space for Black histories, but also to make sure that their children would have somewhere that they could learn about their place as a Black person within British history. So it wasn't about making a siloed space. It was about making a space that was that helped to be inclusive, so that helped to broaden aspirations, and that helped to really counter the toxicity of being a person of colour in the 1980s. And it continues to have an incredibly deep an almost iconic role in the hearts and minds of Black communities in the UK and also in Europe.
And you mentioned a couple of phrases there. You talked about creating a Black-led place for Black people and broadening opportunity and countering toxicity. I'm interested also in how Black Cultural Archives can change perceptions of, or even just to raise awareness of the histories of Black people in the UK amongst in wider society. Because I assume that Black Cultural Archives is not just for Black people. It's really there to try and open a door or open a window onto the stories and histories of the Black community in Scotland, so that everyone can better understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's for everyone. Its primary aim when it was founded, as I say, was to make sure that these histories were kept and recorded and celebrated. And I'm sure at the very heart of our founders' interest was very much thinking about their children first and foremost, but thinking about their children as members of wider society. And so we have all sorts of people who research and come into Black Cultural Archives, and our programmes and our activities are for everybody. And so we have collaborations with King's College in London, for example, and the University of Roehampton. We have lots of international visitors that come to us in a normal year that doesn't have a pandemic for summer school workshops. It's a part of British history that is little told outside of Black Cultural Archives, but is becoming more and more told outside of Black Cultural Archives. So it's really part of our mission to make sure that we're not the only place. We really want everyone to celebrate and love and learn about the history of Black people in Britain, going back to the African garrisons that were involved in the building of Hadrian's Wall, for example, or Mary Seacole, who looked after both sides in the Crimean War and came home to an enormous celebration up and down both banks of the Thames. She came back as a war hero, and she was Scottish. Scottish heritage, Scottish Jamaican heritage. So we kind of understand at BCA, as I'm sure most people who work in history and heritage understand, that our history, our British people's history, is a global history, and part of BCA's role is to help people, wider British society, local Brixton communities, whoever, to start to be able to understand that global inheritance and our shared history, and what those interactions are and what they mean, and how we got here, basically, how we got here and where we're going.
In an earlier talk that I heard you give, you talked about the idea of the civic archivist, and I think this touches on a theme that we've covered in earlier podcasts about archivists, having the potential to be agents for change, agents for social justice, in terms of the decisions that they make. I wonder, what do you mean by the term civic as you describe this idea of a civic archivist?
So the idea of the civic archivist, I was really inspired again by museums practice. So there's an article called "The Role of Civic Museums" that was created, I think it was maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, by Peter Latchford and the English Civic Museums Network. So that article really inspired me to think about, well, what is the kind of civic inheritance and genesis of archives? They have a really different development to museums. Like museums, part of the reason that they were created was a kind of Victorian idea of giving the working classes something to do so we don't get in trouble, whereas archives have a very different genesis, which is more to do with the kind of control of access to knowledge. But kind of rolling on from but that idea that I spoke about earlier of archivists being humans within society, they are not kind of artificial intelligence automata that are kind of programmed to do certain things. And the idea that, as you've quoted, that archives are like the soul of the age or whatever it was I said, can't remember. Then there must be a role in my mind for archives and archivists to have a dialogue with the times that they're in, and that for that dialogue to be a positive and constructive one that benefits and builds and nourishes society, and that it goes both ways, and that's kind of at the heart of what I think when I think of the civic archivist. For the civic archivist to be a useful member of society in a nutshell, and for the archives to be a useful tool for society.
Yes, and the idea of an archivist as a controller rather than as a neutral agent, I think, is an interesting one. Do you believe then that archivists have this wider civic responsibility to ensure that they represent all aspects of society in their work, or do they do that already?
Archivists, right, so in their practice, I do believe they've got a duty to represent and reflect everything that is relevant to the collections that they're looking after, that they're the custodian of for whatever period of time. But I don't think that should be read as that individual person needs to somehow kind of achieve like Zen-like powers of compassion and understanding and insight. I think it means that individual person should know and seek out and be curious about who they could work with, and to be alive to looking at where are the blind spots and where are the gaps. And if it's not possible to see the blind spot because it's your blind spot, then who can you bring in to help you kind of interrogate and investigate, and who can you partner with? Would it be like Hull History Centre, for example, partnering where the local authority partnered with the university and made a much richer experience for the people of Hull as a result? What can be done? So I think it's more of a question of an open and socially engaged practice than for all the onus to be on the individual. And I think that can be a point of anxiety for archivists, as archivists are trying to kind of navigate like understanding digital preservation and blah blah blah, and they're like, now we have to be socially engaged as well. And but I think it's more about the practice, the professional, how you approach your profession, than it is about having to change as an individual.
And does this, and this reflects a statement or a comment that you made earlier on in this conversation, does this reflect a need to change archival education in terms of how archivists are trained to think about the process?
Absolutely. And I think that, as far as I know, the universities that offer the archival courses in the UK are in active discussion about what should be included in the archival curriculum. I'm not, aware at the moment of how far they're getting with that particular bit of archival education, but I know that UCL are really engaged with Black Cultural Archives, and we've done work with University of Liverpool as well, occasionally. So I think that the universities are engaged with it, and I think that the idea of the apprenticeship, which would be an alternative to going and having formal university education, is actually really interesting as well, because I know that for me, in my development of my outlook on archival practice, my experience at Connecting Histories was completely formational, completely essential to how I've turned out as an archivist. And that kind of learning on the job is, I think, something that the value of that cannot be kind of understated. When it's I actually found archival theory, studying it, not as interesting as I find archival theory now as a practitioner. So now I'm obsessed with archival theory, and as a student I was like not really into it. So I think there's something about being a practitioner and like being alive to like continuous development that is essential.
Well, Arike, it's been a really interesting conversation, and I wonder maybe if we could draw it to a close by thinking about some of the personal aspects of all of this. Archives, at the end of the day, tell the stories of people and communities and wider society. And I wondered maybe if we could just end by you saying what difference the work of Black Cultural Archives has made to you, but also maybe if you could reference some of the people that you've worked with in terms of what difference has made to them on a very personal level.
Sure. So for me, working at Black Cultural Archives has really evolved and changed my outlook and made me even more committed to the world of archives and the difference that it can make for individuals and communities. Some of the work that we've been doing at BCA includes BC has a huge oral history collection relative to the size of the other collections, and that reflects the importance of oral traditions in African descent communities. And so some of the work that we've been doing with our oral histories has been really transformational for me in my understanding of how oral histories can be used, but also means that we've been able to work with people to create new writing, new fiction, new artworks. We had digital artists in residence in autumn 2020, and those artists were, they say that their practice has evolved and changed because this is the first time that they interacted with archival sources in such a free way. And some of the artists said that it actually changed what they think about their own Black British identity, which is just incredible, really. It's like the best thing that you can hear if you're the sort of archivist that I am, that someone's identity that they brought that is a Black British one, and they brought it to a Black British archival collection, that collection in fact informed and transformed their own understanding of their own identity and of the art that they were able to make afterwards. And I know a couple of those artists have gone on to get more Arts Council funding for their own projects to develop further the work that they started when they were in residence with us. So that kind of thing is just absolutely amazing to me, but also just for in a kind of more sort of local community way, we've been able to bring together older generations and younger generations in our building. So we're super excited to open the building again after lockdown so that we can have more of those living interactions between service users, essentially people who are coming in to use and celebrate Black history in our space are having their own interactions as a result. And I think that's something that is really that I'm starting to understand more by working at Black Cultural Archives, in the way that archives can be a convening space and a forum as well as sources of historical knowledge.
Well, thank you, Arike. This has been really a fantastic conversation, and I've taken a lot of messages out of it, not least of which is the transformative power of the archive in the right hands. So I'm really impressed by all the work that you and your colleagues have done at Black Cultural Archives, and I very much look forward to visiting you whenever allowed to at some point in the future. So thank you again, Arike.
Thanks so much, John. It was a really good conversation. I always like to be able to reflect on archival practice, and I really appreciate all of the questions that you were asking.
Thank you.